An ordinary grocery trip suddenly transforms into an unforgettable showdown when an elderly woman tells a young black man to go back to Africa. What he says next doesn't just silence the room, it changes everything. The grocery store hummed with the usual rhythm of daily errands. Shoppers pushed their carts down aisles, some lost in thought, others quietly chatting. It was a sunny afternoon in a small neighborhood in Ohio, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone. But today, the usual flow of routine would shatter in the most unexpected way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, adjusted her glasses. She had the air of impatience, muttering under her breath as she reached for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and carefully pinned silver hair gave her an unassuming look, but what followed was anything but ordinary. A young black man, tall and dressed casually in a blue hoodie and jeans, approached the same stand, reaching for a bag of oranges nearby. His name was Daryl. He was calm, polite, and seemed to blend effortlessly into the store's flow, texting on his phone while balancing a basket of groceries. Then it happened. The elderly woman turned sharply, noticing Daryl's presence. Her expression shifted, it wasn't subtle. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pursed tightly. "You people don't belong here," she said, loud enough for others nearby to hear. Daryl froze. His fingers hovered over his phone. When he looked up, she didn't stop. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The air thickened. The hum of the store vanished. A few shoppers stopped in their tracks, exchanging uncomfortable glances, while others pretended not to hear. The rhythm of the store was replaced by an awkward silence, one that seemed to stretch far too long. Daryl's initial reaction was shock. His brow furrowed, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might say something right then and there. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow breath. His face remained unreadable, as if weighing every possible response. The woman, still clutching her apples, stood firm, unapologetic, unwavering. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone in the store could feel it. A young mother quickly steered her child away, while an older man, near the potatoes, glanced nervously at Daryl, waiting to see what he would do. The silence became heavier than any words, setting the stage for what would come next. For a moment, Daryl stood completely still, his hand gripping the handle of his grocery basket. The world around him seemed to shrink, every sound in the store muffled. Every face turned in his direction. The weight of the woman's words hung in the air, like a bad smell no one could escape. The elderly woman didn't back down. Her stance was defiant. She seemed to expect no arguments. She adjusted her cardigan with a huff, chin lifted, daring him to respond. A young employee, stacking bananas a few feet away, froze mid-motion, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. A cashier craned her neck for a better view. The growing crowd didn't get any closer, but they didn't leave either. They were witnesses now, like it or not. Daryl glanced at the woman. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of thought. 1,000 responses raced through his mind. He could lash out, yell, storm off. But none of those options felt right. The tension pressed on him like a weight, but instead of breaking, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He shifted his basket to his other hand and straightened his posture. His presence seemed to grow larger in the silence. When his voice finally came, it was calm, deliberate, cutting through the awkward atmosphere. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured. "Do you even realize what you just said?" His question wasn't accusatory. It was reflective, almost as if he were giving her a chance to think about her words. But she wasn't interested in reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was it. A young woman near the bread aisle gasped audibly. The quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder. Yet Daryl remained steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. Instead, he let the pause stretch, giving her words a chance to settle in the ears of everyone around them. "All right," he said finally, nodding slowly. His calmness was disarming, almost unsettling in its strength. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The room held its breath. The storm was coming, but it wasn't the kind anyone expected. Daryl shifted his weight, setting his basket down on the floor with deliberate care. His calmness felt like gravity, pulling everyone closer. even those pretending not to listen. He fixed his gaze on the elderly woman, not with anger, but with a quiet determination that made her shift uncomfortably. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady but firm. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." His words carried weight, each one spoken like it had been carefully chosen. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he said, pausing just enough to let the words sink in. "He was a sharecropper, working land he didn't own, breaking his back so his kids might have a better." The scene in the grocery store had been ordinary, filled with the hum of daily errands, until an unexpected clash shattered the calm. It was an afternoon like any other in a small Ohio neighborhood, where everyone seemed to know everyone. Until the words were spoken. There, near the produce section, an elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s, was adjusting her glasses, her face an image of impatience. With a muttered huff, she reached for a bag of apples, her faded cardigan and neatly pinned silver hair, giving her an unassuming appearance. But what came next was far from ordinary. A young black man, Daryl, tall and casually dressed in a blue hoodie and jeans, approached the same stand, reaching for a bag of oranges. He was calm, polite, seemingly blending into the flow of shoppers, texting on his phone while balancing a basket of groceries. But when their paths crossed, the atmosphere changed. Without warning, the elderly woman turned sharply, noticing Daryl's presence, and her expression shifted, subtle at first, then glaringly obvious. Her lips tightened, her eyes narrowed, and she didn't hesitate. "You people don't belong here," she said, loud enough for others to hear. The words hung in the air, suffocating, and Daryl froze. His fingers hovered over his phone. A chill swept through the aisles. Some shoppers stopped mid-step, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Others, pretending not to hear, hurried past. In that moment, the store's usual rhythm ground to a halt. The tension was thick, palpable, and for a long moment no one moved. Daryl's initial shock was evident. His brow furrowed as he slowly looked up. He was processing, holding his breath. Would he speak up, retaliate? Instead, he stood perfectly still, taking a slow, deliberate breath. His face unreadable, but his mind working. The woman, still holding her apples, stood her ground, unapologetic, firm. Her presence radiated defiance, as if daring him to respond. A young mother quickly steered her child away, while an older man nearby nervously glanced at Daryl, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But the silence stretched longer, heavier than any words could have been. Daryl's hand gripped his grocery basket, and the world around him seemed to shrink. The faces of everyone around him, the sound of the store, the lights, they all blurred. The weight of the woman's words lingered, thick and bitter, like something no one could escape. The elderly woman, unwavering, adjusted her cardigan, her chin lifted high in challenge. She clearly expected no rebuttal. A young employee mid-task froze. The cashier craned her neck for a better view. The growing crowd didn't step forward, but they didn't leave either. They were witnesses now, whether they wanted to be or not. Daryl, however, wasn't done. His eyes never left the elderly woman as the tension stretched on. His mind raced. He could lash out, storm off, shout at her. But none of those options felt right. Instead, he shifted his basket to his other hand, straightened his posture, and his calmness filled the space, making his presence impossible to ignore. When he spoke, his voice cut through the silence with a quiet power, measured but strong. "Ma'am," he began, "do you even realize what you just said?" His question was neither accusatory nor filled with anger. It was reflective, almost as if giving her the chance to reconsider her words. But she wasn't interested in reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising, defensive. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." A gasp rippled through the crowd. A young woman near the bread aisle audibly inhaled. The murmurs began to grow louder, but Daryl stood firm, unwavering. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. Instead, he let the silence grow, forcing everyone to face the reality of what had just been said. Finally, he spoke again, calm, but with a quiet strength that seemed to hold the room in place. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The room seemed to hold its breath. What would come next? Daryl took a deep breath, setting his basket down with deliberate care. His calmness felt like gravity, drawing everyone's attention, pulling them closer, even those pretending not to listen. His gaze was unwavering as he locked eyes with the elderly woman, not with anger, but with quiet determination. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady. "Let me tell you something about where I come from." His words weren't hurried. Each one was deliberate, like it had been chosen carefully. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," Darryl continued, pausing just long enough to let the weight of the words settle in. "He was a sharecropper, working land he didn't own, breaking his back so his kids might have a better life." The elderly woman's lips tightened again, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was hanging on his every word. A man near the dairy section, who had been glancing at his phone, now put it down entirely. An older couple whispered to each other, but didn't look away. "My grandfather," Darryl went on, his voice now gaining strength, "he fought in World War II. He fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, only to treat him like dirt when he came back. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." A hush fell over the room. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed quieter now. The tension was building, rising like a storm. But Darryl wasn't finished. "My parents," he said, his tone softening, but his words still carrying the same weight. "They fought too. Not with guns or fists, but by working every day, raising me to believe in kindness, respect, and hard work. My mother's a teacher. She spent her whole life helping kids, no matter what they looked like. My father, he's a mechanic, the kind of man who'd stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car broke down." His eyes locked on hers, never wavering. "So you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa?" He shook his head slightly. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more. Because my family paid the price for it. In blood, sweat, and tears." The elderly woman's face flushed. Her hands trembled slightly, clutching the apples. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. The tension was so thick, you could feel it in your chest. Darryl took a step back, his composure unshaken. "I could have walked away," he said, addressing the crowd now. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this. To be better than words like those." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The silence that followed was almost deafening. And then it was broken. A man from the deli counter clapped slowly. It started as a hesitant gesture, but soon others joined in. People began to clap. Not just for Darryl's words, but for the courage it took to confront hate with dignity. The elderly woman looked around, her face pale. No one came to her defense. No one. With her cart still tightly gripped in her hands, she turned and wheeled it toward the exit, her shoulders slumped in defeat. As she walked away, a few people moved toward Darryl, offering silent comfort. One woman placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The message had been sent, and it had been heard. The moment lingered in the air, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The crowd, once tense and scattered, began to slowly dissipate, but something had shifted. It was as if the words Darryl had spoken were still echoing in their minds, shaping their thoughts, challenging their assumptions. Some faces were lit with inspiration, others deep in thought. Yet everyone, in some small way, had changed. The scene in the grocery store, so ordinary just moments before, now felt different. Quieter, more contemplative. It was as if the very atmosphere had been altered. Darryl, however, remained unmoved by the tension that had once surrounded him. He continued with his shopping, but each step seemed measured, as if he were still processing the weight of the moment. The impact hadn't shaken him, but it had left him reflective. At the checkout line, the young cashier who had spoken up earlier scanned his items, her hands slightly trembling. She offered him a shy smile, then paused. "What you said back there," she began, her voice soft, "it meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace." Her words hung in the air, almost like a thank you, but more than that, a recognition of something profound. Darryl smiled back, his tone warm yet humble. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through," he said, his words thoughtful. Anger just builds walls, outside and in. As he walked out of the store, the sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Daryl's car was parked just a few spaces away, but as his eyes swept across the lot, something caught his attention. There, sitting in her car, was the elderly woman. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her posture stiff. For a moment, Daryl thought about walking over to her, perhaps offering one final word of comfort, but he stopped. He realized that some lessons take time. The seed had already been planted. Later that evening, Daryl sat with his father at the kitchen table, recounting the events of the day. His father, a man of few words, listened carefully, his hands folded on the table in front of him. When Daryl finished, his father spoke, his voice steady. "You did the right thing, son. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her. She might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. And sometimes that's all you can do. Plant the seed and let it grow." Daryl nodded. The weight of his father's words settled over him. He realized that, while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it was necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted. And silence? Silence only allows it to fester. Across town, the elderly woman sat alone at her dining table, staring at an untouched plate of food. Daryl's words replayed in her mind, each one cutting through the thick layers of her long-held beliefs. She thought of her grandchildren and the world they were inheriting. For the first time, she felt a sting of something unfamiliar, doubt. Her heart was heavy with the realization that her assumptions might not be as solid as she once thought. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened in the grocery store began to spread. Word of Daryl's response, the courage, the dignity, the unwavering truth, traveled through the neighborhood. It was no longer just a fleeting incident. It had become a lesson, a reminder of the power of words, and the importance of standing up for what is right. Daryl never sought attention for what he had done. In fact, he preferred to remain unnoticed. But his quiet stand sparked conversations that had long been avoided. Strangers approached him, expressing gratitude, sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His actions had ignited a fire, a movement of sorts within the community. And the elderly woman, well, she began to change. It wasn't immediate, but Daryl's words had planted a seed of doubt, one she couldn't ignore. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but if she did, she hoped she would have the courage to apologize, to acknowledge the wrongness of her past thinking. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean speaking calmly, with conviction, and letting the truth do the rest. In a world where words have the power to divide or unite, to hurt or heal, Daryl's quiet stand proved that actions speak louder than anything. And now, to everyone watching, let this story be a reminder. Your words and actions matter. They can shape the world around you. They can make it better. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can spread messages of hope, courage, and understanding, creating a better world one word at a time.